Everybody, I'm going to review this album, Cat Stevens' Buddha in the Chocolate Box. It's always been one of my favorite albums, not just one of my favorite Cat Stevens albums. I hope you'll consider watching. Well, this album came out in 1974, and this is one of the albums I bought in the Columbia House Record Club. At that time in my life, I kind of remember, and a lot of those albums I listened to a lot. So those albums that I bought in that period of my life, I tend to know really well. I was maybe like 14, 13, 15, and I listened to this album a lot. I've always thought it's really a good album. Of course, it has Over a Young on it, which was sort of the hit on it, if you will. And Ready is on here, which is also was on his Cat Stevens' greatest hits, although I don't actually remember hearing that on the radio that much. But it's a really good album. You know, one just sort of preliminary comment I would have before I say much else is I think this is one of those albums that shows the effect of his conversion to Islam, because I think there are a lot of really good songs on here. It came out in 74. Now, that was he was in the sweet spot of his career. He was just coming off Foreigner. And, of course, by then he was huge with Teaser and the Firecat and Tea for the Tiller Man. So he was kind of at the top of his popularity, even though I don't think Foreigner was all that well received. But still, you know, he was right in the heyday of his career. But he did this album. And then he did Numbers and Is It So? But it wasn't too long after this album that he started to kind of withdraw from the music business somewhat. He did a pretty nice tour in 1976, which I remember that tour because I wanted to go and I was too young. My parents wouldn't let me. But he played at Cobo Hall. That was in 1976. But you didn't hear. It wasn't too long after that he kind of started to withdraw from music, and of course by the late 70s he had converted to Islam. And so I always thought this is another one of those examples of an album where he was taking some new directions. He had kind of more of an ensemble sound. You know, it's still an acoustic album, but he had keyboards, he had an organ, he had drums. His guitars were kind of more varied, and it was kind of more of an ensemble unit, you know. And if you watch that 1976 tour, which is available now, there's a concert that he did at William and Mary College during that tour that I finally saw, and it's just excellent. And he does some of the songs off this, and it just shows you the potential that we kind of lost, you know. It's his business that he converted to Islam, but a lot of these songs on here just had the potential to be really epic, and he did them on this album, and you know maybe did some of them some you know, but then within a couple years he was kind of out of the music business, and some of the songs on this would have just continued to evolve. I think he's got like King of Trees and Bad Penny. Those are really good songs. So I've always really thought that about Numbers. There's some good ideas on Numbers, I think, that could have continued to kind of evolve. You know, maybe Cat Stevens in the 80s, a couple live albums, more shows, you know, redos, you know, whatever. But it just shows kind of the way he cut his own career short in the 70s. It's his business, but I think this is kind of another one of those albums where he was taking some really interesting directions, and there's some really fine songs on here. One of the things, we'll just kind of look at the album. This is a nice album cover. On the front, you've got a Buddha from the 10th century. That's a Buddha from Asia, I think Japan, although it's in the London Museum. And Buddha in the Chocolate Box. I'm going to say a little bit about that. But then you've got, the nice credits. And this is the chocolate box. We know because on the back he's got a little cartoon that shows Buddha in the chocolate box. And there's the cover of the chocolate box. So when you open the chocolate box, you get the vinyl record. And there are all the little Buddhas. Buddha. You know what? I'm starting to realize that's the concept. Buddha is the chocolate. I was raised a Christian. I guess that's kind of like Christ saying, "I'm the bread of life." Buddha is the food. So, and then you get the albums or the lyrics. Then you get the lyrics. But it's a really interesting album. It's kind of like Catch Bullet 4. It shows that he was flirting with kind of religious ideas. I don't know how overt they are. He does have a song on here called Jesus, in which the first verse is about Jesus and the second verse is about Buddha. It's a very beautiful song. We used to go to a rescue mission when I was in high school, and it was a pretty low-pressure environment, but I would play some guitar sometimes with my dad and other people in our church. And I remember I played that song one time. I knew I couldn't get away with playing it at a regular church service, but those drunks in the Pontiac Rescue Mission seemed just fine with it. But it's kind of a spiritual song, a very, very good song. But it's kind of, I guess the famous story is Cat Stevens was on an airplane and he was tired and hungry, and he was reading a book on Buddha. Is that right? I hope I don't get this wrong. And the stewardess, the flight attendant, came up and asked him if he would like some chocolate. So he kind of was weighing the two, the Buddhism, or a book on spirituality and philosophy, the life of the mind, the life of the soul, and then the carnal, the chocolate, And so that is a kind of a neat concept. And again, I was raised around a lot of Bible, and it reminds me, in a way, of Christ's teaching that man shall not live by bread alone. That we have the physical selves, which is fine. We're all have physical bodies, physical needs, physical appetites, and so on. But we're more than that, and I think that's what Christ meant when he said, "Man shall not live by bread alone." And maybe that's kind of the concept here, that there's a part of us that transcends the physical appetites and even the body itself. And it's a neat concept. And on the back, you do have some nice Cat Stevens art, which kind of illustrates the story. Well, Cat Stevens almost always had nice art on his albums, some more than others, but a lot of his albums, he would have nice original art. And he was a fine artist. He could have been an illustrator for a children's book or a magazine or something, I think. But here he's on the back of Buddha in the Chocolate Box. See, this is the back. There's the front with the 10th century Japanese statue of Buddha, which is in the London Museum. But on the back, he's got this little cartoon he made us. That I guess kind of illustrates the idea of Buddha in the chocolate box. There's Buddha, a young Buddha, a kid Buddha, walking down the path. I guess that might be the path of life, or maybe the path of enlightenment. And this is an interesting little detail. The Buddha comes across a spider playing a flute. There you can see in the next one a little closer image of the spider playing a flute. And in the next thing, we see Buddha starts to imagine, and he imagines a box of chocolate. By the way, there's the box of chocolate, and the box of chocolate on the album. See, that's the box of chocolate. That's like the cover of the box of chocolate. So then the album's inside there. You get the lyrics. But here's the box of chocolate. So Buddha sees a spider playing a flute, which is a strange image. I tried to just a little bit research into that, or try to find out if there's any significance to a spider playing a flute. And then Buddha sort of starts to dream or imagine, and he imagines a box of chocolate. And I was thinking about that. Now, is that spider good or bad? At first I thought, well, maybe the spider is kind of like a tempting force, kind of like Christ being tempted in the wilderness, by Satan. And one of the things that the devil used to tempt Christ, wasn't it, was his physical appetites. Turn these stones into bread. And Christ made the famous retort, man does not live by bread alone, which is kind of a similar concept if you think about it, that we have our physical needs and that they're part of what we are, but we also have our spiritual needs. So, but I actually looked a little bit into the significance of spiders. I've got this old encyclopedia set, Man, Myth, and Magic. And this is volume 19. And it actually has a little section on spiders. It's an old encyclopedia, and it's mostly on English folklore about spiders. But you do have some Asian images of spiders there. The earth spider. But, and sometimes spiders were actually good. That they kept the house clear from other kinds of bugs that were less desirable. So I don't know, maybe Cat Stevens could explain to us the significance of the spider, but I found that a very interesting detail. Then he starts to dream. He sees in his dream, he sees a box of chocolate. Look, he's got his tongue sticking out. Looks like he's ready for a piece of that chocolate. Opens it up. There's the piece of chocolate, which is a little Buddha. So the Buddha is in the chocolate box, and then Buddha. Oh no! Don't say those same idle lies. I heard them before. All this fool who left half his heart on an early train won't buy no more. Oh no, don't use those same weeping eyes. I'll wipe them no more. I didn't want to have to be cruel, but the truth must be said in you. Ain't heard enough. Oh, it was not so long ago since you wandered out of here. And then Buddha realizes, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Looks like he's realized that he must take the spiritual path. And he leaves the spider and goes on his merry way. It's kind of a beautiful story. Now sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Did Sigmund Freud say that? You see symbolism and everything. That's sort of precarious. But that is interesting that he sees the spider. Then it makes him think of this box of chocolate. He opens the box of chocolate, but then he sees the Buddha. The chocolate is shaped like a Buddha, and that seems to kind of bring him back to his senses. Just, oh my gosh, what am I doing? I was going to eat a piece of chocolate. Horror of horrors, which I guess is not just a piece of chocolate. It's the carnal life, a life of indulging the appetites over the spirit. So he leaves the spider and off he goes. Beautiful art, as usual. And it's an interesting concept. And again, it does remind me a little bit of the Christianity I was raised with. It talks about our physical selves, but also our spiritual selves. Man does not live by bread alone, and many other passages in the Bible that distinguish between the physical self and the spiritual self, however you would want to call that. There's some great songs on this album. It opens up with music And I remember when I was about 15 or 16, I had some friends over at my house one time, and we were listening to albums, and they were all into Foghat, and which I was too. I like Foghat, and a lot of the run of the mill but great 70s rock bands, Aerosmith, things like that. And I put on this album, and I turned it up kind of loud because I knew these guys liked rock, and we listened to music. And they remember saying they didn't know Cat Stevens rocked like that. And I do think it's kind of a rockier album. It's not, you don't hear a lot of screaming lead guitars or, slide guitar solos or something in it. But it is a album with pretty, it's got an edge to it. If you turn it up, some of these songs, you turn them up into your speakers, they give you that kick to your chest. That's what I mean. I think he was going in some different directions that I think were kind of interesting because his acoustic stuff was so great. And this definitely has the acoustic flavors on it still, but it is more of an ensemble album. I wouldn't say it's an electronic album like maybe Is It So? And I think Foreigner really kind of was experimenting with keyboards and things. The keyboard is kind of mixed in as an ensemble instrument. I would call this sort of an ensemble album. In some ways, it's kind of an adult contemporary album if you listen to it, but very kind of smooth 70s studio playing of an ensemble, and it's very good. And of course, Oh Very Young's in here. I remember in English class, you might have heard me talk, I had a really good English teacher for a couple years actually. And, I still think about her class a lot. But I remember one day she really impressed a lot of us when she started quoting Oh Very Young and saying how much she liked Cat Stevens. And she was, which is true. It's got Sun C79. I think Sun C79 is such a good song. It's I think it's about the same young lady, Lady Darbanville, that he sings about in Mona Bones Jacone. And it's a little bit like Robert Plant in 10 Years Gone on Physical Graffiti. He's kind of looking back at a relationship that he used to have now that he's at a different part of his life. And it's got a dreamlike quality to particularly, there's kind of a mellow section and kind of a more agitated section. And they kind of go back and forth, but that mellow section is really beautiful, and it's got kind of a dreamlike quality. And I remember one night back in those days when I was listening to this album a lot on vinyl with a nice stereo. Remember when we used to have stereos in our bedroom? I'd have a nice FM receiver and a turntable and all that. And I just remember it was night, and the stereo was on. And there was a glow in the room of that. We're getting some thunder here. There was a glow in the room of that stereo receiver, and the room was dark. And that Sun C79 came on with those little kind of chime-like notes and that acoustic guitar. And I'd heard it before, but that was one of those times that really caught my attention. How nice that was. And ever since then, I think I was maybe 14 or 15. I've just always remembered that Sun C79. Ghost Town, I never listened to too much, but it's a good song. Jesus is a really nice song, and I think that, again, is one of the many Cat Stevens songs that have a spiritual and or religious connotation, not, fundamentalist American religion, but a kind of spirituality and a kind of philosophy and religion. And the first verse, as I mentioned, is about Christ, and the second verse is about Buddha. As I said, they used to call him Jesus a long time ago. He turned the world to order, don't you know, Christianity. They crossed the wood and hanged him a long time ago. They still misunderstand him, those that don't know. And in the evening his love will lead the blind. In every secret corner, there in your mind. And then the verse about Buddha. But, Cat Stevens was raised a Christian. And it is kind of interesting. He did this album and Catch Bullet 4, which are pretty overtly flirting with Eastern mysticism, which I would associate more with Hinduism and Buddhism. What we used to call Eastern mysticism in the West. I don't know if that term is even applicable anymore or useful, but that was, Eastern mysticism when they used to use that term in the 60s and 70s. It usually referred to Hinduism and Buddhism or philosophies from that part of the world. I didn't associate it as much with Islam, although I don't think it excluded Islam. But it is kind of interesting that he did these albums that kind of flirted with Buddhist concepts, Catch Bullet 4-2, and then converted to Islam. So, but side 2 is really good. You've got Ready. And then, but the two songs that always stood out to me, and when I always say this is such a good album, I'm usually thinking of Sun C79, and then King of Trees and Bad Penny, which are on side 2. And if you haven't heard those songs, they were kind of album tracks. But again, they point to me that a direction that Cat Stevens might have gone if he had continued in music, because it's great ensemble playing. That King of Trees has kind of an outro, which is kind of epic, and it's kind of pop rock. It's light rock, maybe adult light rock you might call it, which is different than Tea for the Tillerman, if you think. So I would say King of Trees is kind of light rock, but it also has kind of it sounded like, could be almost like a Genesis song, or like a kind of a mellow Yes song, or they could have developed it in that way. And Bad Penny's really good too. I've got my 12-string here. Bad Penny is, oh no, don't say those same idle lies. I heard them before. All this fool who left half his heart on an early train won't buy no more. Oh no, don't use those same weeping eyes. I wipe them no more. I didn't want to have to be cruel, but the truth must be said in you. Ain't heard enough. Oh, it was not so long ago since you wandered out of here to become a silver model of a city on the air. So, great song, super duper good song. But that one part goes, I had enough of you sneaky bars and smart parties. I had enough of you sweet friends and lovers. I had enough of you lonely rooms and black faces. I had enough, and I want you no more. I want you no more. Then that trumpet comes in, like a soprano trumpet or something that comes in. It's just climatic. It's one of my favorite passages of music. That section of Bad Company. Some of you watching this might never have heard it, but I listened to that when I was 14. I would say still to this day, that little section in Bad Company where that Bad Penny, not Bad Company, that little section in Bad Penny where that kind of climaxes with that trumpet coming in is maybe one of my favorite passages of any music I've ever heard. And that to me was a kind of evolution of Cat Stevens' music. I think you have elements of that in all his earlier albums. Like I love 18th Avenue, but the band was really good on this album. Like I said, it's kind of light contemporary, almost like could be like a adult contemporary light rock album. But it was also kind of like a Genesis album in some of those songs, and just a fantastic album. Some really good background vocals. Another passage that I would say is literally one of my favorite passages of any music is those female singers in "Oh Very Young." Those female singers in "Oh Very Young." That again is maybe one of my favorite passages of music of anything I've ever heard in my life. That when those girls, Will you carry the words of love with you? Will you ride? Will you ride? Oh, it's just again, just literally those two passages, and they're both on this album. There's some of my favorite passages of any music I've ever heard. And I've listened to a lot of music, so when I say I like this album, I like it a lot. And I think I just wish you could have done more like this. But they're the singers. By the way, one thing I noticed, it's got those old '70s symbols for men and women. The circles with the. I was wondering if that's an outdated concept these days, but the men were kind of the circle with the arrow, and the women were the circle with the kind of the plus sign or the cross on it, which you used to also kind of see with feminism. And I was thinking maybe you don't see that anymore. But anyway, it's a fantastic album. And Cat Stevens has a lot of fantastic albums. And I won't say it's uneven, but the whole album is good. And several of these songs, I would say, are some of the best, have some of the best music in it that I like anyway, that I've ever heard in my life. Particularly that passage in Bad Company, or I keep calling it Bad Penny, where that trumpet comes in, those female vocals in Over a Young, that kind of haunting, dreamlike part of Sun C-79, and King of Trees, which to me could have been almost like, it's kind of like adult contemporary, but it also kind of reminds me a little bit of prog rock. I mean, and I like Rick Wakeman, but I think I like it better than some of the Rick Wakeman and things I've heard, because I think it has such a good sense of it. It's kind of atmospheric and progressive in that sense, and yet it also has great melody and lyrics. And some of that prog rock I don't think had that. So I think it would have been great. To each his own, but to me this is another example of sort of some of the things we got a little taste of the music Cat Stevens would have done in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, and because he was always evolving, and this album really shows it. The whole album is good, and several of those songs I mentioned are, like I said, literally some of my favorite songs I've ever heard in my life, and some of the musical passages, as musical passages, are literally I think some of the most satisfying musical passages I've ever heard, even if it's just 8 or 10 bars, just some really wonderful stuff. And he had a super duper good band. So I definitely recommend this album, and particularly those songs, of course, Over a Young, but Sun C-79, King of Trees, Bad Penny are just wonderful songs. Thanks. God bless.